This week, we're moving into the third covenant of salvation history, which is God's covenant with Abraham. And in this lesson, we will look at how God's covenant blessing passes from Abraham to all nations. We'll see the connection between covenant blessings and the trials that God's faithful children undergo. We'll also examine how God rewards Abraham's obedience by renewing the covenant he made with him. That renewal comes with a promise that all those who were separated and scattered when God destroyed the Tower of Babel will one day be regathered into the family of God. And that's the entire story, pretty much, throughout salvation history. God, his family, and always trying to get everybody back into the family. Finally, we'll see how God's people eventually make their way down into Egypt and then trace the events that lead to the Exodus. So the first thing we'll do is recall that in Genesis 1 and 2, it tells us that at the very beginning of the world, God gave his blessing to creation. The sign of that blessing, or more accurately, that thing that reveals that blessing, is life, both the gift of life itself and the power to bring forth new life. That blessing is passed on from generation to generation. Through what? Through the family. But the blessing of natural life is not the only family legacy. The covenant blessing is also passed on through families. We see in Genesis when, after the fall, God's blessing is restored through Noah. We see that in Genesis chapter 9. And Noah, in turn, passes that blessing on to his firstborn son, Shem. If you think back to our last session for a moment, you'll recall that when humanity tried to go its own way at the Tower of Babel, God confused their language and scattered the people to the four corners of the earth. He did that because they were aiming for their own glory instead of God's, and that occurred in Genesis 11. And then just one chapter later in Genesis 12, God promises Abraham, who is a descendant of Noah's son Shem, and if you remember we said we'll be following that line, that he will bless him. He also promises that through Abraham, all humanity will be blessed. In just 3 verses, Genesis chapter 12, verse 1, 2, and 3, God actually uses the word bless 5 times. As in the past, this blessing will be transmitted from generation to generation through Abraham's descendants, through his family. From God's conversation with Adam in Genesis 12, we also learn that man will never be united through his attempts, such as that at Babel, to make a name for himself. Rather, true unity will only come about through God, who promises to make Abraham's name, or his Shem, great. Now, I think I was talking the last time, I thought it was a revelation to me that when we hear the story of Abraham and he sees the 3 men, or he sees the three kings, I don't know how they mentioned in the Bible, he addresses them as Lord. Now, it doesn't say he addressed all 3 of them as Lord, but it also doesn't say he addressed one as Lord. So this might be the first time we're actually seeing the Trinity without actually knowing it's a Trinity. And if you go back to Genesis 1, where God says, let us create man in our image, and remember, this was way before the Catholic Church began, so you can't say, well, we made that up to enforce our belief in the Trinity. This becomes really interesting because we hear of God calling himself our, and then we see Abraham addressing 3 men as Lord. And it's just easily to pass and not realize that. But when you go back, it's pretty cool, I think. If we look again at our salvation history timeline that we drew the last few weeks, we can see how God continues to expand his family through covenants. So far, we've seen how God expanded his family from 2 people, Adam and Eve, to a family, which was Noah and his household. And through his covenant with Abraham, God expands his family even further. Where Noah was the father of a household, or a nuclear family, so to speak, Abraham is the head of an extended family. He's the chieftain of a tribe. Also, if you think back to the study on creation, you'll remember Adam's disobedience triggered the covenant curses, that these curses were passed down from Adam to all humanity. And conversely, because of his righteousness, Adam's failure is partially reversed, with God's promising to bless all humanity again through Abraham. So let's see how this all unfolds in Scripture. Let's take a look at our first reading, Genesis 12, verses 1 to 3.
So to read now? Okay.
Lourdes, that's you, my dear.
Yes. So Genesis chapter 12, verses 1 to 3. Abram's call and migration. The Lord said to Abram, "Go forth from your land, your relatives, and from your father's house to a land that I will show you. I will make of you a great nation, and I will bless you. I will make your name great, so that you will be a blessing. I will bless those who bless you, and curse those who curse you. All the families of the earth will find blessing in you."
Okay. So God promises Abram, whose name he will later change to Abraham, 3 things. He promises him land and nationhood, a dynastic kingdom or a great name, and a worldwide family. All families will be blessed through Abram. And later, because of Abram's patient endurance and faithfulness, we'll see God upgrade these 3 promises to 3 covenant oaths. When God first calls Abram, which by the way means exalted father, to leave his home and journey to an unknown land, Abram is 75 years old, very wealthy, and childless. Despite his age and his wealth, Abram obeys. So again, you have to picture, he's told to do something and he doesn't hesitate. He doesn't say, well, let me check my calendar and see, or he doesn't say, well, let me prepare first, Lord. And he just picks up and goes. This is why he is the father of faith. I could never do that, I don't think. But Abram does exactly that. And along with his wife, Sarai, his nephew Lot, and many domestic servants and their families, Abram leaves to begin a nomadic life of wandering. And of course, I got to take another second to go off track here because it mentions that his nephew Lot. Later on, he refers to Lot as his brother. We refer to that when we talk about Mary's children, when they say, are these not the brothers of Jesus and the brother and sister of Jesus? Because there was no word for cousin, so they referred as brother. They were able to use that interactively. Abram used his nephew and called him his brother when he was actually his nephew. So later on, when we get into that story of Mary and her children, and they say Jesus' brother, it should not be confusing, at least to us in the Catholic Church. We believe that they are not real brothers and sisters. And this is really one example that proves how that is used interactively and where people get that wrong. So, again, he's with his wife, his Sarah, and they begin a nomadic life of wandering. And that starts off in Genesis 12. The book of Hebrews tells us that he did all this in faith, trusting God's call completely. Leaving his home and his kin at age 75 is only one of the minor trials Abram will endure after being chosen by God. And as we'll see throughout the lesson, Abram's life reveals that the road to blessing is paved with trials and temptations. These trials will include famine. We'll hear that in Genesis chapter 12. Exile and the temporary loss of his wife. Family strife and division. Wars. Unfulfilled promises, and marital discord. We'll also hear about painful surgery when we talk about the circumcision, supernatural disasters such as Sodom and Gomorrah, the temporary loss of his wife again for the second time, more family strife and division, and being asked to sacrifice his beloved son. But the remarkable thing is that Abram's faith grows stronger through each of these tests. And God rewards that faith by upgrading his promise of blessings to covenant oaths in Genesis 15, 17, and 22. Let's take a look at Hebrews 6:13. Is Helen with us this morning? Helen had that reading and she's not with us. So let me see. I might be able to jump to that reading. Give me a moment's notice. Hebrews 6:13, because I know nobody prepared for that. Okay, so 6:13. For when God made a promise to Abraham, since he had no one greater by whom to swear, he swore by himself, saying, surely I will bless you and multiply you. And thus Abraham, having patiently endured, obtained the promise. Men indeed swear by a greater than themselves, and in all their disputes an oath is final for confirmation. So when God desired to show more convincingly to the heirs of the promise the unchangeable character of his purpose, he interposed with an oath. So in a moment, we're going to see how each of those promises becomes a covenant oath. But first, we want to quickly point out the fulfillment of another very important promise, a promise that points forward to Christ. In Genesis 12, God promises to bless Abram. In Genesis 14, he fulfills that promise when Abram encounters Melchizedek, the righteous king of Salem, which in Hebrew does mean peace. In Genesis 14, verses 17 through 20, we learn that Melchizedek is not just a king, but also a priest. He is actually the first person to be literally called a priest in Scripture. And during their encounter, Melchizedek offers bread and wine. This is the first we're hearing of this type of offering. Then blesses Abram. Abram, in turn, pays homage to Melchizedek by offering a tithe. In this encounter, Melchizedek prefigures Christ. So Melchizedek makes this little cameo appearance, and yet he's referred to over and over and over again as we go forward. So he gets a lot of playtime for this one quick showing. And by the way, the homage that he paid to Melchizedek by offering a tithe, he offered him 10% of what he had taken when he had gone to save his nephew, and he battled some kings and took what he won in the battle. This is where we get the 10% tithing today, by the way. So that was started with Abram. So in this encounter, Melchizedek prefigures Christ because, after all, Christ is also a priest king who offers bread and wine and receives our homage. The author of Hebrews makes the similarities even more explicit. We'll see that in Hebrews 6:19. Stacy, that's yours?
Yes. This hope is a strong and trustworthy anchor for our souls. It leads us through the curtain into God's inner sanctuary. Jesus has already gone in there for us. He has become our eternal high priest in the order of Melchizedek. This Melchizedek was king of the city of Salem and also a priest of God's Most High. When Abraham was returning home after winning a great battle against the kings, Melchizedek met him and blessed him. Then Abraham took a tenth of all he had captured in the battle and gave it to Melchizedek. The name Melchizedek means king of justice, and king of Salem means king of peace.
All right. Thank you. So back to those covenant oaths. In Genesis 12, God promised Abram that he would make a great nation out of him. But many years later, in Genesis 15, Abram is still childless. And remember, the name Abram means father, so it was a little bit of an insult there. When God comes to him again and promises him a great reward, Abram reminds God that he has no child and asks God, what's the good of a reward without a son to inherit it? At this point, God swears a covenant oath to give Abram a son, and through him innumerable descendants. God also tells Abram that his descendants will be delivered from bondage and receive the promised land, the land he promised to Abram back in Genesis 12. God then seals his covenant with Abram in a mysterious ceremony, where God himself passes between the remains of animals cut in two by Abram. This ritual oath ceremony marks the first promise God made to Abram, land and nationhood, and that's being upgraded to a covenant. More time passes, however, and that promised son still doesn't arrive. Not surprisingly, Abram and Sarai grow impatient and decide to take matters into their own hands. Sarai tells Abram that he should take her Egyptian handmaid, Hagar, and have a son with her. Abraham takes her up on the offer. And also, not surprisingly, that was a big, big mistake. To start with, it creates some serious domestic problems, because once Hagar conceives a son, as Genesis 16:4 tells us, she begins looking upon her mistress, Sarai, with contempt. Abram and Sarai's decision also eventually creates a few geopolitical problems that are still with us today. You see, that son born of Hagar, who was Ishmael, becomes the father of the Arab nation. And we know very well that they're still fighting today. And those descendants of Abram's never do learn to get along with their siblings, the Jewish people, who are the descendants of the son Abram eventually has with Sarai. 13 years after Ishmael's birth, God again appears to Abram, and he gives both Sarah and Abram new names. Abram will now be Abraham, which means father of a multitude, and Sarai will be Sarah, which means great mother. Kings of peoples shall come forth from her, God says of Sarah in Genesis 17. This foreshadows God's covenant with David in 2 Samuel 7. Next, God tells Abraham that his shortcut of getting him an heir through Hagar didn't work. Ishmael is not the son of the promise. That son will be born of Sarah. Then God swears a covenant oath with Abraham and Sarah that he will give birth to a son, that they will give birth to a son 1 year later. There is, however, a catch. The promise of a son through Sarah includes a command. Abraham must circumcise himself and all the males of his tribe. Also, from that day forward, all of Abraham's descendants must be circumcised on the eighth day. Despite the fact that Abraham is 99 years old at the time, despite the fact that Sarah is 90, and yes, even in those days that was too old to have a child, despite the fact that circumcision was going to be way less pleasant, Abraham trusted God, and he did what he was told, and that obedience reveals him to be a man of tremendous faith. 1 year later, Abraham's faith is rewarded. Sarah gives birth to a son, Isaac. The child grows strong and healthy, and on the day he is weaned, his father throws a great feast in his honor. But during the feast, Sarah sees Ishmael playing with her son and begins to fear that he will try to usurp Isaac's place, possibly by doing her little boy harm. This is heard of course, because we remember the story of Cain and Abel. So to protect him, she asks Abraham to banish Ishmael and Hagar from their camp. At first, Abraham hesitates. After all, it is his son, and he loved him very much. He might not have been the son of the promise, but he is still his son. Abraham loves him, so rather than act, he waits for directions from the Lord, and the directions do come. God tells Abraham to do as Sarah wants, but promises to one day make a great nation out of Ishmael's descendants. So once Ishmael is banished, Abraham is left with only one son, which is his beloved son Isaac, which we'll hear later, your only beloved son. Many years pass. Then comes the ultimate test of Abraham's faith. After all this time waiting for a child, and the child growing up, God asks him to sacrifice Isaac on Moriah, the site of present-day Jerusalem. And unbelievably, without even hesitating, Abraham does it. He gathers the supplies they'll need and sets off on a 3-day journey, a journey that he believes will end with the death of his son. Only they arrive at Moriah, or once they arrive at Moriah, Isaac carries the wood for the sacrifice up the hill. We read about this in Genesis 22, by the way. Isaac then asks his father, we have the fire, we have the knife, we have the rope, but where is the lamb for the offering? And Abraham's response, God will provide himself the lamb. And sure enough, just as Abraham is about to plunge the knife into Isaac, the Lord calls out to Abraham and tells him to spare his son. Abraham then spots a ram and offers it to the Lord instead. Afterwards, for the third and final time, God renews his covenant with Abraham, swearing in Genesis 22 to bless all nations through the seed of Abraham. So let's get this story more under our belts. Isaac is strong enough to carry the wood up the hill, so it's not child abuse where his father's forcing him to do this. And Isaac is probably stronger than his father because his father's got to be about 115, 120. Isaac could be somewhere around 13, 15, 16. So the Jewish people used to call this the sacrifice of Isaac, of Jacob, of Abraham and Isaac, because they believe Isaac gave himself willingly. They even go on to tell the story that Isaac may have even told his father, tie my hand so I don't have some second thoughts. And it never really was a sacrifice because he was never killed in the sacrifice. So it's now called a story. It was then changed to the binding of Isaac, which is the same story. And there's a lot of important stuff here about Moriah, which you heard say later becomes Jerusalem. And of course, we'll hear about that later when we talk about the last covenant with Jesus, where Isaac carries the wood of his sacrifice up that hill. And when he asks his father, where is the lamb for the offering? And Abraham says, God will provide himself the lamb, which of course he does provide himself. In fact, later on, as more of a prophetic, he provides himself. If Jesus is the Son of God and he is God himself, then he does provide himself as a sacrifice. We're wondering, many times even theologians wondered, was Abraham given this prophecy? Was he able to see ahead? Was he able to see that this would actually come true? And then another interesting story about when they look over and see the ram caught with his head in the thicket, which is, weeds and thorn bushes. And one day when this story was being told in Jerusalem with Dr. Hahn, a little shepherd boy jumped in and said, that still happens today, but we don't free them because they get more injured. So what they do is they cut the thorn bushes on each side. So if you picture this, if Abraham did the same thing and he cut the thorns instead of ripping him free, then when he sacrificed that lamb had a head of thorns, a crown of thorns on his head when he was sacrificed with Abraham and Isaac. So this is really amazing stuff when you start learning, the behind the scenes of these stories. And one thing that everybody always asks, why would God ask him to kill his son after he waited for so long? And I think it wasn't necessarily that he wanted to kill his son. He wanted the promise. He wanted to see if he would actually go through. You see, you can have faith and say, okay, I'll do it. And, you've mentioned the faith. But when you carry it out, then you show the faith and you prove the faith. And that's all that God wanted him to do, was prove his faith. Once he pulled the knife and was ready to do it, God was ready to stop that whole thing. And of course, they mentioned it was a 3-day journey. So Abraham got his son back on the 3rd day. Very interesting stuff, I think. Okay, so going back to our story, the oath God swears in Genesis 22:18 echoes the promise he made to Adam and Eve in Genesis 3. So if you'll recall, in Genesis chapter 3, he promised to bring deliverance through the seed of the woman. Now, God promises to save the world through the seed of Abraham. Just as the woman's seed, not the woman herself, will bring salvation to the world, likewise it is Abraham's seed, not Abraham, who will redeem the world. Both seeds, of course, are the same person. This is Jesus Christ, who is the woman's seed, and of course also Abraham's descendant. Let's read Galatians chapter 3. Sherry, that's yours, correct?
Yes, I put on my mic. Galatians
All
3,
right,
14 to 17. Christ did this in order that the blessing which God promised to Abraham might be given to the Gentiles by means of Jesus Christ, so that through faith we might receive the Spirit promised by God. My brothers, I am going to use an everyday example. When 2 people agree on a matter and sign an agreement, no one can break it or add anything to it. Now God made his promises to Abraham and to his descendants. The scripture does not use the plural descendants, meaning many people, but the singular descendant, meaning one person, only namely Christ. One more.
17, right?
Sorry. Yep, one more. What I mean is that God made a covenant with Abraham and promised to keep it. The law which was given for the The law, that which was given 430 years later, cannot break the covenant and cancel God's promise.
Okay, so you can see in Galatians how they're reading back into the Old Testament or the Jewish scripture, and you see that typology happening. And that's exactly what we're meant to do, because the Old Testament was about promises. The New Testament is about the promises fulfilled. So you have to look back from the new into the old and see how that happens. So as we said earlier, in the story of Abraham, we see almost the opposite of Adam's story. When Adam disobeyed God, humanity was cursed. But when Abraham obeys God, even to the point of sacrificing his beloved son, humanity is blessed. And eventually, through Abraham's seed, the curses man incurred at the fall will be fully reversed. Note the title of this slide. It says The Obedience of Abraham and Isaac, which I kind of led to earlier. How, you may wonder, was Isaac obedient? Well, the ancient rabbis used to talk about this story. They called it the Akedah. It was called the Akedah, or the binding of Isaac, which I kind of jumped ahead on, but we're seeing it here, which meant the binding of Isaac. And they believe that this story is as much about Isaac's self-offering as it is about Abraham's faithfulness. And this is because if Isaac was strong enough to carry the wood up the mountain, which he was, then he was strong enough to probably resist being tied up to that pile of wood as a sacrifice. He was a grown youth, not a little boy. He could have stopped his father, but he didn't. In fact, Jewish tradition said that Isaac was bound at his own request. He asked to be tied down so that he would not panic and start to struggle against his father while he was being sacrificed. Likewise, the previous covenants we've discussed, the early church fathers understood that the sacrifice of Isaac foreshadowed the sacrifice of another only beloved son, and that is Jesus Christ. Like Isaac, Jesus is the only beloved Son of the Father, sacrificed for the salvation of the world. Like Isaac, Jesus carries the wood of his own sacrifice up the mountain in full submission to his Father's will. Hebrews 11:19 tells us that Abraham was willing to sacrifice his son because he considered that God was able to raise men even from the dead. So that's exactly how Adam should have seen it. If I was created from nothing and I gave up my life to save my wife in the garden, God should be able to give that life back to me. But we know that he didn't do that. Abraham had that faith. And indeed, Jesus is raised from the dead on the third day, just as Abraham received his son back from the sentence of death at the end of their 3-day journey. In the church's liturgy, this story in Genesis 22 is also read in connection with Jesus' transfiguration, which we just had that reading recently. There at the top of Mount Tabor, the apostles hear God the Father say, "This is my beloved Son." This evokes God's words to Abraham on Mount Moriah, "Take your son, your only son, Isaac, whom you love." The difference, of course, is that God the Father did not stop the death of his beloved son, but rather let Jesus' self-offering fulfill the covenants. Abraham, of course, had no idea how his actions would foreshadow that day of ultimate blessing. But even his words to Isaac, "The Lord will provide himself the lamb," come true in Christ. Interestingly, God provides that lamb, Christ, at the very place of Abraham's sacrifice, Moriah. Remember, that's what we said. Later in Israel's history, the Temple of Jerusalem is built on Moriah. So it's a mountain range, like the Appalachians or like the Catskills. So Moriah was a mountain range. So Jesus climbed the same mountain range with the sacrifice just as Isaac did. I mean, you can't make this up. Later in Israel's history, the Temple of Jerusalem is built on Moriah. And we hear this in 2 Chronicles chapter 3. And there the people of Israel offer their sacrifices, in effect reminding God of his promise to Abraham. The need for those sacrifices comes to an end, however, when Christ is sacrificed on Calvary. Incidentally, that was one of the prophecies, that when the Messiah comes, that sacrifice will no longer be needed. So I often say to my friends who are Jewish, when was the last time you've seen an animal sacrifice? they actually came to an end at around 67 AD. And that's because in 67 AD, that's when they started to fight the Romans, and they used the temple as a fortress. And we know that the Romans conquered, they destroyed the temple, and after that, animal sacrifices no longer happened for 2,000 years. So Calvary is one of the peaks of Moriah, and this we've come to know. We see that there are no more animal sacrifices, so there another prophecy has been fulfilled. Before we move on and find out how Abraham's descendants managed to get themselves enslaved in Egypt, let's briefly review the promises and the oaths of God's covenant with Abraham. Remember, in Genesis 12, God made 3 promises to Abraham: a land or nation, kingship or a great name or royal dynasty, and we hear about that in Genesis 12, and worldwide blessing. And later, these 3 promises are strengthened by covenant oaths. In Genesis 15, God swears an oath that Abraham's descendants will be delivered from bondage in a foreign nation and given the promised land. In Genesis 17, God swears that kings will come forth from Abraham and Sarah. And finally, in Genesis 22, God swears that all nations shall be blessed through Abraham's descendants. Now, about those descendants. As you recall, or as you should know, Abraham's son Isaac has 2 sons, Jacob and Esau. And just as God chose Abraham's younger son Isaac, rather than his elder son Ishmael, to be the son through whom the blessings of the covenant passed, so too is Isaac's younger son Jacob chosen over his older brother Esau. Also, many years later, Jacob's younger son Joseph will be chosen over his older brothers. This is a subplot that runs throughout the Bible, the younger being chosen over the elder. If any of you do not know the story of Joseph, that's a wonderful story. You could find that in Genesis chapter 37, the story of Joseph and his brothers. So this is a subplot that's happening where the younger is often chosen over the elder, because over and over again in Scripture, the oldest son is prideful. They lose that grace. And just as Adam, the firstborn of creation, fell into pride, virtually all the oldest sons in the Bible fail in a similar way. More importantly, however, according to how the world thinks, the older should be chosen. After all, shouldn't the older and stronger son have the pride of place? Pride, our downfall. But God flips that argument upside down. He chooses the younger son over the elder son to show that his plans are fulfilled through his power and not man's. And St. Paul makes this clear when he writes in Romans 9 that God chose the younger over the elder in order that God's purpose of election might continue, not because of works, but because of his call. So it depends not on man's will or exertion, but upon God's mercy. Besides the younger being chosen over the elder, what happens to Abraham's offspring? Well, to start with, Jacob, Abraham's grandson and Isaac's son, gets a new name. Just as his grandfather's name was changed from Abram to Abraham, Jacob's name is changed to Israel. Israel has 12 sons who eventually become the fathers of the 12 tribes of Israel. Before that happens, though, those 12 sons make their way down into Egypt, and the story of how that happens is how the book of Genesis ends. The beginning of the end, so to speak, is when Israel gives one of his younger sons, Joseph, a very beautiful coat. Of course, we know that play from Broadway, right? Joseph in the amazing Technicolor Dreamcoat. But his older brothers become jealous, and they want to kill him, but then they decide to sell him into slavery so they could benefit from his absence. And in Egypt, where he eventually ends up, Joseph lives as a slave and then a prisoner until he has the opportunity to use his God-given gift of interpreting dreams. So here we hear of Joseph the dreamer. And of course, back in the New Testament, or further ahead in the New Testament, Mary's husband, Joseph, is also a dreamer. He uses that gift of dreaming to explain a dream of the Pharaoh about a coming famine. And as a result, the Pharaoh makes him, in essence, the prime minister of the country. So if you don't know the story of Joseph, a great story to read, to get familiar with that, how Joseph is sold into slavery and winds up becoming second in charge of Egypt. Joseph's wisdom spared Egypt from famine, but the rest of the region wasn't so fortunate. And accordingly, Joseph's brothers, like many others, come to Egypt hoping to buy food. And there the family is reunited. But of course, it doesn't happen that easily. We're just kind of summarizing it, because when the brothers come to Egypt, they do not recognize Joseph. Joseph does recognize them eventually, and he does a couple of things to bring them back a couple of times. Plays a couple of pranks on them that aren't really pranks for fun, gets them very scared and nervous, but eventually it's just to let them know who he is. He does eventually know who he is. They get scared that he's going to have revenge. He promises them that he's not there for revenge. He does save his family and brings them to Egypt. What winds up happening, to make a long story short, is they were brought to Egypt so that they can prosper, but they were supposed to go back to their land, and they never did. And they stood there. And because they never went back to the promised land, as a result, they become enslaved in Egypt, and other people populate the promised land. That's why when they get freed 400 years later and they go back, they're afraid to go in there and conquer. They don't listen to God. They say, oh, we can't overtake that. We can't do that. Okay, so the family stays in Egypt. And what happens is a new Pharaoh comes into power later on, and that's how they wind up being imprisoned, because hundreds of years later, the new Pharaoh just doesn't honor the deal that was made many, many years before. So instead of returning home to the land God gave them, however, all of the brothers remain in Egypt. They live in luxury. That life of luxury eventually turns into a life of misery when a new Pharaoh arises who doesn't know or even remembers Joseph, and who sees the Hebrew people as a threat. So the new Pharaoh enslaves the sons of Israel. As they wait for deliverance, the Hebrews find hope in God's words to Joseph. In Genesis chapter 48, verse 21, it says, God will be with you and will bring you again to the land of your fathers. And way back in Genesis 15, God also had promised Abraham that he would deliver his descendants from slavery. So this was all to be expected and all to come. So the Israelites know help is coming. It's just a question of when. So in the next session, we'll look at the arrival of the promised help with the coming of Moses, as well as the direction God's relationship with Israel takes once he has delivered them from Egypt.